America today is not the America of 50 or 100 years ago. The country has changed. How does that change affect the church? And does it change her mission in America? Join us today as we examine those questions and more with our special guest, His Excellency Charles Chaput, Archbishop of Philadelphia, and author of the new book, Strangers in a Strange Land. I'm Michael Hernon, Vice President of Advancement at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, and you're watching Franciscan University Presents. Stay with us. Welcome to Franciscan University Presents. I'm your host, Michael Hernon, Vice President of Advancement at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. And I'm joined in our studios by our regular panelist, Dr. Regis Martin, Professor of Systematic Theology here at Franciscan University, and Dr. Scott Hahn, who holds the Father Michael Scanlan Chair in Biblical Theology and the New Evangelization, again here at Franciscan. And our very special guest, His Excellency Archbishop Chaput. Archbishop, you've been the Archbishop of Philadelphia now for a number of years. Right. Previously, you were in Denver, most recently, and then before that, as in Rapid City as well. You have been a stalwart, a champion of the faith. You are Capuchin, which is always unique as a Franciscan. We welcome you back to our campus, and you've been the author of Render Unto Caesar, as well as the book we'll be primarily talking about today, Strangers in a Strange Land, Living the Catholic Faith in a Post-Christian Land. So it's a very challenging and provocative title, but welcome back to Steubenville.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
Yeah. So we're talking about a new America. What today makes America a new America? Or what changes have really happened in America that have really made this transformation, this change?
Well, those of us who are older probably have a better sense of what I would mean by a new America, because things are so much different than they were when I was a college student, for example, both in terms of the...
That was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. I'm 72 years old, so I graduated from college 50 years ago already, so it's a long time ago. But that was a time when Judeo-Christian principles were at least apparently embraced by the majority of people in the culture.
Right.
And for example, if someone was running for office back in those days for president, they wouldn't have gotten elected if they had a divorce in their background.
Right.
Those just simple signals like that indicate a changing perspective. As we look at the candidates that were running for office this past year, people who talk like that or had positions like were held by them would never have been considered for office even. Yeah. So we live in a very different time. Back in the 1950s and 60s when I was growing up, perhaps 75% of Catholics went to church on Sunday. Now in Philadelphia, it's around 20% that go every Sunday. So it's just huge differences. The churches were full back in those days. Yeah. Now we're closing and merging parishes because so few people go to church. In Philadelphia, which is the place where I serve now, we had more than 200,000 children in our Catholic school system and thousands of religious women teaching in the schools, literally thousands. Now we have 60,000 students in our Catholic school system.
And the population has grown too.
The population has grown, and maybe we have 100 sisters, and many of them are working part-time because of their age. So just those kind of external things have changed. Now my worry, and that's why the book is written, is that although the things that happen around us, we've been kind of like those frogs that die from boiling water, but the water is heated slowly. Yes. They don't know how to get out of the pot until it's too late. And whether it's too late or not, we could debate that, I guess, but things have changed very, very much. And most Catholics that I know are not aware in a very emotional way of the changes that have happened.
Could you repeat something that you had said earlier, because I'm not quite sure I heard you. It was so shocking. The number of Catholics who go to Mass in Philadelphia now is what?
20%.
20%? Mm-hmm. I mean, if that continues much longer, they won't need you.
Well, I think
they'll still need
they
you.
won't need me, but they'll need a bishop.
They'll need him more than ever. They just won't recognize their need.
But you are so right. I mean, you look at the churches were full, the families were intact. I mean, you had so many cultural shifts. What really pushed us in this direction? What allowed this to happen? This is a lot of change.
It's a lot of change, and there are many reasons for it. And I think it's important to notice that it began about 50 or 60 years ago. It didn't begin 10 years ago or 20 years ago. The numbers have been dwindling since those days that I mentioned. So the forces for secularization have been pretty active in our country since the end of the Second World War, I think. There was a recommitment to faith and the church because of the war. A number of people coming back from war, entering monasteries and religious life and seminaries was rather extraordinary, much like what happened after the 9/11 incident. The churches were full maybe for 2 months or 3 months.
Yeah.
But after that, there's been this gradual decrease, and it hit the Protestant communities in a stronger way earlier than ours. Their numbers are much less than ours, the mainline Protestant groups anyway. It would take a long time to go into all the reasons for it. But
I think Pope Benedict had put his finger up on the malaise when he cited the phenomenon of a silent apostasy.
Yes.
That people are leaving and nobody notices or much cares. It reminds me of something the critic and educator Albert J. Nock had said about a century ago. He was asking the question, how might a civilization know if it slips into a dark age? And his answer was, all the lights have gone out, but nobody notices. It's dark. And I think that's what we're seeing. And that's doubly dismaying.
yes, it is.
You have your work cut out.
Well, we do, and it's not just the work of bishops, it's the work of the whole church.
That's true.
And today, even more than before. I think one of the blessings of our time, if you consider it's a blessing in itself, but is that lay people have to assume their proper role in the church. They have to be co-responsible for the gospel. They can't leave that in the hands of the clergy. I was at a conference recently where someone said that the first pastors of children are parents, and those of us who are pastors in another sense are tools that parents can use to help the formation of their kids. But unless the parents are involved, all this other stuff, including Catholic schools, are going to be useless.
Yeah, I mean, John Paul, who did something back in the 80s and 90s in his vigor, something like a rollback, not only worldwide, but here in America with Reagan there as president too. But he speaks of parents, he spoke of parents as the primary evangelizers, But how can they function if they're not evangelized themselves?
Or if they even know that they're the primary.
That's right, yeah. I'm reminded of Israel in exile, because that's where I think Catholic Christians find themselves today. And I'm also thinking of the prophet Jeremiah, who in the latter chapters, this is where we get the term a Jeremiad, a sermon that is a haranguing prognosis of gloom and doom, The last several chapters of Jeremiah are that way, not because of Israel's exile, but because Jeremiah was upset that the Israelites didn't know they were in exile.
Yes.
Yeah. That he was trying to the lights are off and you don't even notice. You're in exile and you don't care. You don't even long for the days where you could go to the Jerusalem temple. And I do think that describes things today. But there's another layer too that I observe, and that is people don't notice the change. I mean, when you talk to people even our age who are progressive, they look back 50 years and they don't want to even look back 50 years. Because, it's like the Ice Age. Yeah. It's something that was so regressive. By looking back, you might start hankering, and so the only reason you look back is just to kind of criticize that sort of thing. And I thought it's odd that traditional morality is odd.
Yeah. It might be self-evident in some ways, but all of these changes, this new America presents a lot of challenges to the church as an institution, to Catholics individually. What are some of those challenges that are now at our doorstep, that are right here in front of us today?
Well, what's our role in terms of the broader society? What are we supposed to do? How do we fit in? There's a lot of talk today about the Benedict option, going back to the time of St. Benedict and forming communities separate from the rest of the environment, and in order to educate your children and live peacefully in the midst of all this turmoil. So that's an option people look at, but I personally have not yet gone that direction, because it seems to me that we need to render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and that is a responsible role. in the world around us, I think we need to be actively engaged. The United States has the same Constitution, but people don't mean the same thing by the words when they talk about the Constitution as they meant 50 years ago. I mean, I don't know how many young people are committed to democracy.
Yeah, it's a big shift.
And the wealthy people are committed to the rule of the elite.
Right. Well, Archbishop, you make the point in your book by citing Augustine, and I think that's the option that you might prefer. You would have us exercise that. We are in the world. We can't really take leave of it. And even a profane state provides peace, and we have an obligation to uphold that state, the republic, however corrupt, however much it appears to be in a state of advanced decomposition, and we can smell the carcass. We still have an obligation to stay put and do the best we can, light the candle instead of cursing all that darkness. And I do think your point is well taken, that we can't just insist that the bishops spearhead the renewal. I mean, just as war is too important to be left to the generals, evangelization is much too important to say only priests and bishops can do this. Lay people have maybe the chief responsibility in terms of renewing the temporal order. And we've got to take up our charge.
That's right.
Scott knows the Bible better than I do, but if you look at the Acts of the Apostles, it's a combination of the work of Paul, who was an apostle, and Priscilla and Aquila, who were obviously lay missionaries. They were both equally evangelists. They didn't seem to turn that over to Paul. They assumed their proper responsibility. And Paul actually made tents with them, I guess, as part of his own livelihood. And I think that is the model for the church today. This notion of lay people being co-responsible for the church has its origin in the scriptures and the early history of the church. It's not something new. It's something newly rediscovered for us. But there no longer are lay people co-workers with the bishops. They are co-responsible for the church. And bishops need to acknowledge that, priests need to acknowledge that, and then most of all, lay people need to acknowledge it, because lay people tend to be the ones who generally want to clericalize the church today, give it over to the priests and the bishops.
It's easier to turn it back. I mean, with all these challenges coming, I mean, there's no question we have to do something different.
That's
right.
right.
The church, which is the whole body of Christ, really needs to step up our game.
But one could argue that the 800-pound gorilla in the middle of the living room is this datum you cite. Only 20% go to Mass. I mean, if the Eucharist is at the center of one's life, the center of the universe, and 80% don't think they need to be nourished, what are we looking at? Mass apostasy. I mean, the triumph of mediocrity. I mean, people who are always at their best, and they don't need the body of Christ to empower them. That is terribly sad. I mean, how do we overcome that?
Well, I think the only way we overcome it is families who are committed to passing on the faith to their children. There are wonderful places like Franciscan University where some people come here who don't have a deep religious commitment and develop one. And I think that's wonderful. You see signs of that everywhere in the country, perhaps around the world, the good things that this university's done and continues to do. But most people won't come to school here. Most people will go to a secular university, the place where they're going to receive their evangelization, which is much more important than catechesis, is from mom and dad.
That's right.
By mom and dad's example, before their words, but also their words.
Yeah. The classical approach of the lay apostolate, though, has, in a sense, flourished, not just in spite of everything, but because of everything. I think of the legacy that you left in Denver as the shepherd there, and how the Augustine Institute was established for the new evangelization with Tim Gray and Ted Sri, who are graduates of this school, and likewise, even more perhaps Focus, which is now on. I was doing summer training for over 500 Focus missionaries, and even though it was conceived here, it was really birthed out there. And there are many, many other organizations and apostolates out in Denver and throughout the country. I mean, when I came into the Catholic Church more than 3 decades ago, it was a different landscape. Lay apostolates were present, but apart from Catholic Answers, and EWTN was just getting started. But I mean, now there are just dozens, if not hundreds, and so, it's not just that the 80% represent apostasy, it's that the 20% really need to become our focus to make sure that they're really catechized, that they're really mobilized and equipped to take the grace of the Eucharist that they receive and reach the 80% and beyond the 80%. I mean, it's so easy for me to wring my hands and give into negativity. It's a daily habit for me, you know. At the same time, there's an awakening that has to take place through prayer, as well as through fellowship and through the Eucharist itself. It's Jesus.
You know, knowing the facts is not negative, although the facts are negative. So these kind of, this getting angry and talking about how bad things are can be a very good thing if it wakes us up to the reality. And knowing the truth is always good news, because it gives you a platform on which to stand and begin the work.
Yeah, and the next segment, I want you to go into some of the lessons we can learn from the past that will help us with today. Stay with us for the next segment of Franciscan University Presents.
There are many ways to evangelize. Now, I'm a co-producer with newcatholicgeneration.com, and our basic goal is to reach teens where they're at in their homes through the internet. There's a lot of peer pressure at their schools and a lot of things telling them to not talk about their faith and not be enthused about it. So for us to be able to reach them through that and say, no, it's not weird to be Catholics. It's a really wonderful thing, and you should share that with others, is a beautiful thing.
I believe faith is a very personal thing. And that's why I believe that online representation is so important. It shows how people have taken these experiences in their own lives and actually built them into the truths of the faith and made the faith their own. And I think that's vital to Catholic evangelization today.
People recognize Franciscan University as being academically excellent and passionately Catholic. We have the unique opportunity through our faculty members, through our students, to proclaim that academic excellence by reaching out in many different ways. We also remain passionately Catholic in the way in which we are able to worship, the way in which we are able to bring that love of Christ to others on a daily basis. It's important for us to be able to embrace both.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. We've been talking about being strangers in a strange land with Archbishop Chaput. So you've kind of laid out a little picture of how America has changed pretty drastically in the last 50 plus years. But as we look at this as a church, the church is bigger than America. The church has lasted through empires have come and gone. When you look back at the history of the church, is this an unprecedented time for us? Is there anything we can learn from the past in the church's experience?
Well, I think this is an unprecedented time for us, meaning the people who've been alive for the last 50 to 70 years. But it isn't for the church. You know, the first 300 years of the church we had a church without buildings. And today, in places like Philadelphia, the church sometimes defines itself by its buildings. You know, in the past, you had to risk your life to be a Christian. Now, you're considered primitive in some places if you're a Christian, but our lives in the United States are not at risk yet, and I don't think they will be for the foreseeable future. But things have changed a whole lot, and we have to get rid of our attachments to our memories in order to move into the future, because nostalgia can help us define the church in a way that's not useful. For example, we have huge numbers of large churches in Philadelphia, and because of that, we're spending much of our financial resources on keeping those buildings open, and we're not putting those resources into active programs of evangelization. And there's no way that's going to change in the near future. We have to be willing to give up our buildings, actually. Not completely, but move into maybe smaller buildings and try things in a different kind of way. Unless we have the imagination to do that, unless we actually redefine our understanding of the church in a way that fits the gospel picture of a community of people who are pilgrims on the way to the kingdom of heaven, and we'll use buildings as necessary, but we'll also be free to move in other directions.
I think there's
in order
St. Francis there.
In order that Christ be praised and be accepted as Lord and Savior in our lives. I hope that we'll be able to get that kind of freedom, but it's hard. And it's hard for bishops who are inherently conservative. We are responsible for the patrimony of the church. It's hard for us to take leadership when our people would stand in the way of that. For example, if you want to encourage a parish to envision itself in a new way, and the people want it to be just the way it was, it just leads to paralysis, actually.
At one level, it's totally understandable that people react to the closing of churches or the sale of buildings, because the human attachments, the sentimental,
That's right.
but also the sacramental. I mean, the baptisms, the weddings, the confirmations, all of those things that take place. On the other hand, it's sort of a wake-up call, because once you realize that the church is being sold because it's empty, that's a challenge for lay people to take responsibility for what has happened. And they don't want to. Nobody does, you know. Right. I mean, contraception and, you know, just giving into the secularization of culture at countless layers, you know. That's the sort of thing where lay people understandably are going to be offended, but hopefully they're going to be converted, because they're going to recognize we're going to lose more if we don't really take action.
It seems to me that the business about memory is not terribly important anymore, because if you've got only about 20% showing up, then they scarcely miss what might be bulldozed away. There's no nostalgic itch to return to a past that they never experienced.
It's amazing how many people who don't go to church have that nostalgia.
That's true.
Is that right?
The ones who stand up and are the loudest when you talk about merging parishes are the people who don't go to church.
The cultural Catholics.
I know you saw that in
Philadelphia.
Right. So they do still have but they don't long for Jesus.
Right.
They long for the building and for the memories
glory
of their
days.
childhood.
And the social and political influence the church wielded that those buildings symbolized.
Yeah, well, I love the example. It just reminded me, being here in Steubenville, in a kind of an old steel mill town, and you know, there's many who long for the past, where the steel mills and the coal mines and everything were flourishing in the area.
Right.
But our future doesn't necessarily reside in our past. It resides with taking what we have today and moving forward. And I'm going to use you as a quote. You know, we evangelize at all times and use buildings if necessary. You know,
Right.
that's the quote. So as we look at these challenges of overcoming some things that are really unessential, essentially unessential, what from our church's history do you draw on? I mean, are you drawing that from history as we look at the church that had no buildings in the past? Are there other things that we can look at that the past can teach us how to respond to these challenges and deal with this in a very substantial way? Because these are real challenges, and the church has dealt with different things. It's unprecedented for our generation.
But knowing church history does give us consolation, because you can find many periods where the church had these same kind of crisis of culture. Even St. Augustine, at the end of his life, saw what he knew as reality disappear as the Roman Empire was collapsing around him. But he was able to look at that with a certain kind of peace and joy in his life, because he knew that Jesus was Lord of history. And despite what's happening around us, we can be confident of his presence and our own future. So history does help us to know that. But personally, I'm too old to know what the future is going to look like. I think that has to be in the hands of younger Catholics who actually have the mindset of younger people in our culture. And when they have that mindset and also the faith of the church, I think they can help us map the future, because I think the future is going to be very different than the present.
Right.
You know, I think there's an ironic move that I didn't see coming in young Catholics, at least many of the young Catholics I meet here at Franciscan University of Steubenville, but everywhere else as well. And that is, they're rising up and reappropriating tradition.
Yeah.
And it's not a traditionalist reaction, as you find in some pockets, but they're sort of rediscovering chant, or they're rediscovering images and novenas. But I think it goes deeper, or at least it's going deeper now. And I think they're also going to find themselves backing into a position where they're going to speak out in defense of buildings. Not because we need buildings, but because buildings can evangelize. You know, preach the gospel at all times, use words when necessary. Well, use buildings when necessary, but just like words, buildings are necessary.
Yes.
And buildings with the stained glass, buildings with the statues, I mean, you have a sacramental religion that requires an architectural expression. But what we don't need is 100 of them when only 4 or 5 are really used. But let's make sure that the 4 or 5 that are done beautifully. So that when people come, they recognize not just a cultural oasis, but nothing less than heaven on earth.
It's a kind of dangerous idealism to think otherwise, because we are in the body, we're in history, we're in time, and we're immersed in things, stuff, not just words, but sacrament and the hallowed spaces that people habituate and have done so for generations bespeaks, I think, a certain memory that's alive. I mean, that was the task that I think Solzhenitsyn gave himself, to revive the Russian memory, which had been amputated after 70 years of Soviet communism. We don't face that kind of forgetfulness, that kind of amnesia, but there is a certain forgetfulness that maybe we can attempt to overcome.
Yeah. But we have to be careful we don't fall into nostalgia. Yes. I think some of the young people you speak about are living with nostalgia in some sense, because how are they ever going to be able to even build a church in the future if they don't give money to the church?
That's right.
And they don't give money to the church. Even very committed young people, they don't even go to the same parish every Sunday. See, we're living in a different reality where people are much more mobile. Our concept parishes, are built out of a past when there wasn't so much mobility. What do we do about the future when people don't identify with the parish? How do you ever get the resources to build something beautiful? The reason we have these ugly churches that look like theaters is because they're so much cheaper to build.
That's right.
You can build one for $5 million. Yeah. If you build a beautiful cathedral, it's going to cost you 20.
Yeah.
So they settle for the 5 because that's all the resources they have. Now the church isn't only about resources, but I think you're right. I mean, I hate these ugly churches. I love the beautiful ones.
Yeah.
And we have to preserve the ones that are built so that they don't disappear. But we have to begin thinking even beyond the notion of parish, because young people don't stay put, and parishes are built on the concept of this group of people.
Well, in some respects, technology has become the great enemy, because living in cyberspace, you don't have a sense of place.
That's right.
You don't belong anywhere.
That's right.
You're virtually everywhere. And that, I think, is deplorable.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it's real, though. So it may be the great enemy,
we
but
have to reckon with
they're not stepping out of that world into a world of stability, though. They're not.
Right.
Well, you mentioned St. Augustine earlier. I want to go back to him. If you could just kind of unpack a little bit more. He talked a lot about the city of God and the city of man. What does St. Augustine have to share? What wisdom can he bring, particularly in the light with our challenges today?
He lived in an age when the church was beginning to grow, and the Roman Empire had been converted of sorts. So he spoke about the peace that was given to the church by the Roman Empire as a space where the church could do its thing and grow. But he also made it very clear in his writings that we have to be careful not to be caught up in that world of peace, because it could disappear very quickly. Yeah. So he taught us to live with the wheat and the weeds at the same time, which is very important for us to do. Pope Francis is speaking about this all the time.
Smell like the sheep, being out there.
Well, not only smell it, but he says that we need to also make sure that we don't, we're not hostile towards those who don't agree with us, that we actually love them and they know that we love them. And so that we can't be just negative about the world in which we live. But we have to be cautious, because it can sneak into our way of thinking.
But the world in which we live is negative towards the faith that we believe. When you mentioned Solzhenitsyn, he took upon himself the task of sort of holding fast to the memory of the people. But he also reflected upon the pre-Bolshevik days, when the elders in his village would say, "Men have forgotten God," which happened before the communists took over. And I think we're in that interim position right now, where men have either forgotten God, or actually they remember God, but they're suppressing that memory. It isn't a passive, neutral enterprise. It really is active and publicly so. And ironically, they sort of weaponize toleration and target Islamophobes and all of that. But in the process, we've got to figure out, how to balance we don't want to give into the temptation to nostalgia. But on the other hand, we don't want to let go of a patrimony.
That's right.
Because this represents the faith of our grandparents, our parents, and it goes back even further. And at the same time, it's a beckoning. It's a vocation for us, not just to pay for the buildings. I have a really loose grip on those. But I think at the same time, we've got to tighten our grip on the faith that built those, so that whatever it is we do, we instill in those kids through re-evangelization. You've got to take the cross up. You also got to go to the same parish. You've got to go to Mass every week. You've got to pay
they got to be a part
really
of the
express
family,
this.
the family of God. There is a
In
tangible
a way,
reality.
Archbishop, this is your job description. You recount the friend who told you when you were first ordained as a bishop that you had a twofold function. You are to be a radical, evangelize, live the gospel, imitate Jesus, but also you are a museum curator. You have to preserve the past so that it can be imparted to the future. You've got to preserve buildings. That's pretty practical stuff. While at the same time, you have to commune with Christ.
That's our job description.
That's
too.
true. That's true. Something you've mentioned before is Pope Francis has often cited the book "The Lord of the World." I'm just starting to read that myself, but what does a book 100+ years ago have to say to us today, and why does the Pope kind of mention it a couple times?
Wait, I read it when I read the book when I was a kid and liked it. I've tried to read it twice since Pope Francis became Pope and spoke about it, and I don't like it. And it's hard to read because it's an old style,
Right.
But what was striking about it when I was a young people, living in a kind of a naive world about the church is going to continue to grow, and especially after Vatican II, we thought that once we smile at the world, it's going to smile back at us. It was bringing this notion of the Antichrist into my awareness that even people who are perceived by the broader culture as great leaders, saviors for the future, can really be the presence of evil. And
that's what it is. It's a conflict of the Antichrist.
And actually, Jesus warned us about that. The Scriptures warned us about that. So I think it's important for us always to have one eye on the world around us, awareness of the devil and of evil.
Well, I mean, the Apostle John, he's pretty explicit about the Antichrist. Anyone who denies the incarnation is the Antichrist. I mean, that would include great numbers of people who only go to Mass 20% of the time.
That's right.
He's in our midst.
Enemies of the cross of Christ.
Amen. Stay with us for the next segment of Franciscan University Presents.
We just teach a very simple three-pronged approach that actually Jesus gave us in Luke 10. In that gospel, he said, first go out and proclaim peace. Second, eat what's set before you. And third, and then when the ground is laid, proclaim the gospel. So every one of us, as Pope Francis has asked us to be missionary disciples, can proclaim peace. And secondly, the acceptance, eat what's set before you, accept those people that are before you and love them. And thirdly, when that relationship of friendship and trust is built, then I think the ground is fertile for the gospel.
Explore the treasures of your Catholic heritage on a Franciscan University pilgrimage. Led by inspiring spiritual directors, you'll walk in the footsteps of saints and martyrs in the Holy Land, Poland, France, and Italy. And you'll deepen your love for Jesus Christ through daily Mass, confession, prayer, and the joy of Christian fellowship. Let Franciscan University lead you on a pilgrimage of faith. Find out more at franciscan.edu/pilgrimages.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. This entire program springs forth from the very heart of Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. We're recording this right now in our Communication Arts studio. Our students are operating the cameras and equipment. Our regular panelists are faculty here at Franciscan University. Archbishop Chaput, we have talked about the new America. We've talked about some that we can learn from the past. That this isn't new for the church as a whole, but there is a new path we're carving out today. But there remains a lot of challenges that we have in front of us. When you think about the present moment, the challenges we're facing, what are other challenges that you, even as a shepherd, look at the challenge to evangelize in this culture, even the church institutionally? Are there things that are still impediments to us doing the work of the gospel?
I think there are new impediments for the church now. I think there's this new confusion created by gender theory that is crippling us in so many ways, because we're even reflecting in Catholic schools, how can we respond to this issue? And there are many people, many pastors, many of our school people who are sympathetic with those tendencies in some way. In my own diocese, we have situations where parents have asked for the school to allow someone who is confused to start wearing the uniform of the other gender, and also to be called by a new name.
Oh my goodness.
And we find that there are people in the school system, administration, who are sympathetic with that, and even pastors. It's because we live in a world where that's been an issue, because it's become a major issue for us.
Yeah. And if we cease to remain consistent and courageous in our identity and just simply who we are, being who we're called to be.
Yeah, how can you know what to do until you first know who you are? The question of identity, being, that determines doing.
And it's also important for us not to be reactive, where we just presume, and we need to be sympathetic with the parent and the child and not just from a distance make decisions.
Right.
But we know from the studies that are done that it's very imprudent to make decisions of those kinds when people are very young.
Yes.
And much of this passes with time.
Right.
But there's an impatience in our culture that doesn't allow us to take our time. So the way I'm handling it is we're not letting anyone do that kind of thing. And we're discouraging parents from making decisions where they prematurely support a person who is in some kind of transitional way confused. Whether or not we're going to be able to find a balance, I don't know yet. But those kind of things they're just pouring into the life of the parishes. And laws of the government around things like the HHS requirements, the mandates, but also labor relations. If someone is in a gay marriage, do we fire them or do we let them stay on a job?
Right.
Those kind of things are daily concerns for me in my responsibility as a bishop.
It's the balancing of the truth and the love. Truth can be used as a weapon if alone, but love without truth is sentimentality. I think you've said it similar.
It's true. But if we spend all our time on those kind of issues, we spend very little time evangelizing. We're just protecting ourselves.
It's a distraction.
These are matters that really take your breath away.
They take your breath away and your time.
Questions that never accosted our ancestors.
No.
My wife points out that the more TV or the internet shows babies, those are the most forceful counter-arguments, she says. And I'm convinced that she's right.
She's right.
Because intuitively, people look at that and recognize that there's something sacramental about love, even in the natural order. That maybe I've strayed a long way since my baby photos, but there was something really beautiful and revealing about that. But at the same time, it's within the spiritual culture of Christianity too. I was out at Wheaton a few years ago at the Billy Graham Center, where I was participating in a colloquium with several of the most dynamic emergent church leaders who are independent, non-denominational, but also non-buildings. They insist upon going to the bars or the parlors to evangelize. And the one pastor said, bread and wine, why not pizza and beer? And it took me an hour to recover. But I thought, that's like taking transgender theory and applying it to Eucharistic mystery. I just thought, I've got to not yell and scream and hit this guy. It took me an hour to get back, and then we had a great conversation over lunch. But I don't think I got him even 2 steps beyond that. It's a confusing time.
When you separate yourself from the vine, things become open.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, your wife has really hit upon something profound. I mean, as Kimberly often
always
does.
does.
The best argument against abortion is a baby.
That's right.
I think of Mother Teresa holding up that child and saying, "Look, Mr. Muggeridge, this baby is alive." That pretty much catalyzed his conversion.
Yeah. So as we look at the church in America, all the challenges, how do we respond? Has the mission of the church changed in America?
Well, we respond on all different levels. I think it's important for bishops and religious orders who have seminaries to make sure that the seminary is preparing priests for the new America and not for a past way of being a priest. Because if you understand the priesthood as primarily organizing a good set of buildings and running an institution, it's quite different than seeing it as a field of the new evangelization. And unfortunately, many of our young men in the seminary would rather have the peaceful life of being a old-fashioned pastor than the
administrator of sorts.
The new kind of life that they're going to be facing as priests, and it's going to be very new, different than I've ever experienced it. I think that one of the biggest worries I have, you talk about what are the new worries we have, is the fact that so many young people don't get married, and certainly are putting marriage off for a much later time in life. They don't have confidence in marriage, and I think we should pour the resources of the church into marriage and family issues today. Because that's
Show
the
them
future of the
babies.
church.
Yes.
Show them babies, but also show them happy families.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, you had the World Meeting of Families that you
Yeah.
hosted. Obviously, you had year and a half ago Pope Francis visiting. I mean, that was a topic. It was a real substantial moment in the life of the church
Right.
in recent memory, where marriage and family was front and center. It being debated both in the secular media as well as obviously in the Catholic Catholic homes. And I mean that is a real renewal that's really needed in the church.
Right, but I spend quite a bit of time with young adult Catholic groups, and they're not getting married.
Yeah.
They really aren't. They're afraid to make those commitments. So how do we help them make commitments?
That's a big-
That is, I mean,
That is the seminal
It's
question.
an aversion, it's an allergy. The fear of commitment is so rife and so
Yeah.
deep. You know, it is an alarming thing for me to see, even in our students.
Yeah.
You know, because they'll flock to talks about theology of the body, but when it comes time to actually making that covenant commitment, you know, it's like
To man up.
Yeah, well, you know, I got to keep my options open.
But you know, the enemy of myth is very often circumstance. And when two people fall headlong in love, they want to make a commitment and they want it to be forever. You know, youth wasn't made for pleasure, but for heroism. And fidelity is heroic. And the church has to hold the line on the integrity and sanctity of the sacrament. We can't cut corners. We can't settle for less. We can't say, well, it's an ideal that men and women seldom realize, but we'll accommodate you.
Well,
The church can't do that.
But that's sneaking into the church, that notion that marriage,
It is.
permanent faithful marriage is an ideal,
That's right.
rather than a reality to be embraced by the church. And we just have to be resistant to that.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, and as you look at the secular, cultural, political forces that are waging against marriage, and the church and a Catholic marriage doesn't look that different in sociological terms than a secular marriage. You know, that's a justice of the peace marriage. I mean, I think, and you've kind of alluded to this in the past, I mean, I think we need to make Catholic marriage, sacramental marriage, look very different. And
Right. I'm one of the few bishops, I think, who favor us no longer doing civil
out of
marriage,
business.
getting out of the marriage business, and reserving our witness of marriage to the sacrament, and making it very clear that this isn't what society means by marriage.
that's a bold statement.
It's very bold, but we live in a new age, a new world, and maybe we need a new approach to marriage too on that level.
I think
Yeah,
it's huge.
it's a new approach, and yet it's a very old approach too. Because I mean, when we explain marriage and when we hear them explain marriage, I think that's the rhetorical response, that that's not what we mean by marriage. We're not just talking about different forms of legislation.
Yes.
We're just talking about entirely different definitions of marriage. And so it isn't just the natural law approach that we uphold. Above all, it's the sacramentality of marriage. You know, and that sign value of Christ in the church isn't ancillary. It's not just something that we attach at the end to kind of catechize. It is at the very heart of it, you know. And I do think clergy and laity have got to come together and forge partnerships. And I mean, that sounds nice, but in practice, it's very hard. You know, I'm reminded of a friend who did his dissertation on the 13th century, where Pope Innocent III, who sort of permitted Francis and Dominic to do the mendicant thing, and King Louis IX, the only Louis who's a saint, he wrote a book called Before Church and State, because everybody speaks of church and state back then, but when he went back to the primary sources, nowhere do you have church and state, because King Louis thought of himself not as state. He was baptized, confirmed, and married in the church. He thought of himself as laity. And he recognized that Pope Innocent is clergy. It's not church and state, it's church and church. And together, the clergy and the laity formed a kind of sacramental organism. And again, it's not nostalgia, it's metaphysical reality. It's the sacramental objectivity of who we are and what we do. And evangelization is just waking up and recognizing these mysteries are more real than anybody's presidency.
Yeah. Well, tipping off of that, why is retreating from the public square not an option for Christians? I mean, that's ultimately, you're talking about forging an alliance, church and church together, laity and religious together. But why isn't it? Why can't we just abandon the world? Why is that not an option for Christians?
First of all, you know, I don't want to abandon the world, and I'm not in favor of doing that. But I think we need to have techniques that do that somewhat. For example, homeschooling is basically fleeing the public school system, and maybe even fleeing what they think is an inadequate Catholic school system.
Very true.
And I don't see anything wrong with it. I think parents who are the first educators of children should be the ones who make that decision. And if they're doing it in order to really evangelize their children and catechize them well, I think we should do all we can as a church to support them. I think our Catholic schools offices have to understand that the family can be a school, and they ought to support the family in their education purposes. So I'm not entirely in favor of just staying where we are.
Right.
I think we need to have our
Strategic
parishes.
withdrawals.
Well, our parishes need to be more like that. I think we need to have small groups where couples really do come together and talk,
Yes.
apart from Sunday, where they support one another.
Mm-hmm.
We need Catholic institutions like Steubenville, which are different from ordinary institutions. So there's an element of withdrawal that I think is very important, but it's in order to go back and to evangelize and to...
With a
and to-
purpose.
It's tempting, I think, to invoke the Benedict option in a kind of facile way and say, well, you've got to physically remove yourself, move to some pumpkin patch on the outskirts of Oklahoma City and raise your kids there. I don't think that's what Benedict had in mind, or certainly not Augustine. You bloom where you're planted, what Eric Gill called the cell of good living in the chaos of the world. And that might require greater reserves of heroism, because it's a spiritual detachment from the corrupt city. But you're not unplugged from that city. You recognize that it does have certain essential services, even the post office. You know, they get the mail delivered. Not well, but I can't do it.
Yes.
And a standing army, they keep the roads running. So, I mean, you count on those services.
Yes.
But you're not really enamored of that city. You're in the world, but you're certainly not of it.
And if we don't enter into leadership in that part of the world, it's going to get worse, because that
Right.
vacuum will be filled with people who truly see themselves as our enemies and who oppose us.
You know, I
That
want
separation.
to emphasize that point of getting involved in the world in terms of leadership.
Yeah.
You ran for city council here in Steubenville. My wife is now the city councilwoman at large, and I mean, she's not the president, she's not the senator, but I mean, what she's doing is what she can do. Locally, she is generating so much positive energy, and she's not doing it and she happens to be a Catholic. I mean, it really is her Catholic faith that is the wellspring of so much of the vision.
Yeah.
And she's working with non-Catholics, non-Christians, but I would say the more Catholics can get over that sort of hankering to kind of retreat and enter into the local life of their own community, I think they're more than going to be amazed by the grace.
And I think just that, speaking to that point, people have to have a certain real love for this world, a love for the people, not the world as it's corrupt and falling apart, but for the people, for the city, for the home where you live, for the community, for your school boards, for your Catholic schools, to really love them and get involved and not abandon them, but then start them in the right direction, because we have the plan for renewal of our world. That's the exciting part. We've got a gospel message that everybody would want to draw into, and it will restore cities and towns and communities. Stay with us for the final segment of Franciscan University Presents.
Oftentimes, especially nowadays in the 21st century, we've got information bombarded to us from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed. You know, the first thing we do is check our phones oftentimes in the morning. And oftentimes something that can really help with that is to put the phone aside for the first 10 or 15 minutes or so after you wake up and really focus your thoughts on what do you want to accomplish today? How can it help you grow in your faith life? How can you live out a Catholic life in what you're doing instead of immediately being distracted by whatever social media notifications you have? So that's one way I see as a way to stay concentrated and have a daily reminder in your life.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. We've been talking about being strangers in a strange land with Archbishop Chaput. Regis, could you start us off?
Yeah, most conspicuously, I think I should say that we're all very grateful to you, Archbishop. The witness of your office and your life, very impressive, very edifying and convicting. I mean, I already feel more secure as a Catholic knowing that someone like you is a shepherd, and I'm almost tempted to move to Philadelphia. A couple of random thoughts, images really. the image of the Blessed Mother that you cite in one of your publications, that 13th century manuscript illustration showing Mary punching the devil in the nose. I like that, and I think that's probably what you do 24/7, and that's really splendid. And also Augustine, this image he has of the church as a great net that is lowered into the sea, and you collect all kinds of fish, but it's not our business to sort them out. That's what the angels do at the end of time, the wheat from the tares. And God will decide who goes where. Our job is to get as many people as possible into that net. That, I think, is a kind of exoteric notion of the church, a sort of image of solidarity. You know, I think of Bernini's column at St. Peter's with the arms outstretched, Mother Church embracing all manner of men, a kind of promiscuity. She'll take anybody and then baptize them and urge them to become saints. And finally, this other image from Augustine that you cite, that when people lament the times in which they live, you know, the times are out of joint, as Hamlet says, and cursed be my fate that I was charged with setting things straight. What they're really doing is lamenting themselves. We are the times, and the times are such as we are. And you'd have to be blind not to acknowledge that there has been a great shift in sensibility among Catholics. I mean, Catholics wanted to assimilate, they wanted to be good Americans, and they succeeded so well that they forgot their faith, the faith of the immigrants who came to this country and made sacrifices to build those cathedrals that we have now left empty. We have to restore that elan, that vigor, that faith that fired the imagination of our ancestors. And I can't think of anyone more qualified, better positioned to do that than yourself. Mm-hmm. So get busy.
Thanks, Regis. Scott.
I should say stay busy. You know, I also want to echo Regis and say thank you for your leadership. Thank you for allowing our Lord and Our Lady to work through you in so many ways, not just in Philadelphia and Denver, but EWTN as well. We were there together for the funeral mass of Mother Angelica, and there I began to realize how much and for how long you've been involved in the network too. But the takeaway I always come to is the joy of the gospel. You know, Pope Francis's first real encyclical promulgated there, you know, after the Synod on the New Evangelization. It was an apostolic exhortation technically, but the joy of the Lord is our strength is what Nehemiah 8:10 said. And so it's an objective reality that gives us the subjective response that Paul tells the Philippians, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. And that isn't just giving into optimism. We've got something that Fox and Drudge don't have. Not just a prognosis on a decadent, secularized, anti-Christian culture. We've got the gospel. And we've got something that is so much greater than the bad news. And I think we've got to also launch compelling arguments against all of these dangerous, disastrous trends towards secularization. But we've always got to begin and end with the good news that God loves us and showed us that by sending His Son, not just to die, but to give us the Spirit that draws us into nothing less than the family of God. I mean, if that doesn't get your heart beating faster, nothing, a transplant might be in order. But I think the new evangelization is still the first order of business. It goes back to Vatican II, John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and now Pope Francis. And long after he's gone, it's still going to be the main mission. It was not just the decade of the 90s. It really is a long-term strategy. And I think that when we focus on the joy of the gospel, that's what people find irresistible. That's what is so irrefutable. And I think that's what you're doing. You're looking at the darkness in order to contrast the light of faith. Keep doing it. Keep holding up that light. Yeah, thank you.
Archbishop, do you have any closing comments for us?
I do. You know, I'm not as impressed with myself as you gentlemen are. I know my sins, but I also know that I'm just one cog in this wonderful plan that God has for the church. And you know, the topic of the talk I'm going to be giving at Steubenville on the day that we are having our conversation here is the role of the church in the new America. And the beginning point, of course, is for us to understand what we mean when we say the church. The majority of Catholics still think of the church as the bishops and the chancery, or the pastor and his parish. And that's not the church. The church is all of us co-responsible for the gospel and for evangelization. And we're not going to really move into the new evangelization unless parents and Catholic adults understand that they are as much a part of this notion of the church as those of us who are pastors. You know, what I've found refreshing about graduates of Franciscan University, and I've seen them everywhere I've gone. You know, I've been a bishop for nearly 30 years in South Dakota and Colorado and now in Pennsylvania. But everywhere I've gone, I've been surrounded by graduates of Franciscan University, many of them who do understand that their role in the church is not a passive role, and who do assume leadership responsibility. Some of the movements you talked about in Denver, I didn't have anything to do with them except that I got out of the way. And I encourage those who were the leaders to take leadership and run with it. They didn't need me in order to be free to do that. It's a freedom that comes with being a baptized Christian. And we need to understand that leadership is something we share in the church. Now, I have a unique role because I bring to the church community hopefully the vision of being an apostle of Jesus Christ. And my role is to guarantee that what's being done today is faithful to the apostolic teaching. But that's my unique contribution. I'm not the leader of the leaders. I'm simply a leader among leaders. And I certainly know that we're not going to be able to be successful in making Jesus known everywhere unless we all get busy about doing that. But I'm deeply grateful to Franciscan University for providing so many people for so many years who willingly and enthusiastically embrace that leadership. And I hope that continues.
Thank you, Archbishop. If you've enjoyed today's program, we have a handout. It's the mission of the church in the New America from Archbishop Chaput. Here's the text, and we actually at faithandreason.com will actually have the full talk that the Archbishop gave while he was here on our campus on the topic we've been talking about today. Ultimately, the challenge is before us. You know, how do we become the saints that the church needs for this new day? And the Archbishop is a stellar example of somebody who's claimed his place. So, you know, be who you are meant to be who God has called you to be, and our world will be renewed. I want to invite you to be a part of Franciscan University's mission to educate, to evangelize, and send forth joyful disciples. If you want to renew the world, maybe you should consider getting a degree here on Franciscan University's campus or through our online programs. Or join us at our dynamic summer conferences or on pilgrimages to holy shrines around the world to renew your faith and be equipped for the new evangelization. And go to faithandreason.com to get all videos, as we talked about Archbishop's talk, and so many others to be equipped for the new evangelization. Archbishop, would you give us a blessing?
Certainly will. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he show his face to you and have mercy on you. May the Lord turn his countenance to you and give you peace. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
To download the free handout on today's topic, go to faithandreason.com. Email your request for the handout to presents@franciscan.edu. At faithandreason.com, you can also purchase past episodes of Franciscan University Presents, or request today's free handout and purchase past programs by calling 888-333-0381. That's 888-333-0381, or call 740-283-6357.